I'd like to begin by introducing Steve Coll, my colleague at The New Yorker, who has only won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, but he's still young. His books include The Bin Laden and Ghost Wars, which won the Overseas Press Club Award, and has a new piece out in the current issue of The New Yorker on Tunisia, one of the many uprisings that we are trying to follow in the Arab world. The second guest is Amaney Jamal, who's at the end, an associate professor of politics at Princeton University, where she directs the workshop on Arab political development. And she's the author of 4 books, including Barriers to Democracy, which won the American Political Science Association's Best Book Award in Comparative Democratization. And she has a new book coming soon?
Within the year, hopefully.
Okay, inshallah, called Living Poverty, the Urban and Rural Poor in Comparative Development. And she was named a Carnegie Scholar in 2005. To my immediate left is Marwa, help me with the pronunciation. Sharafeldin. And she's a women's rights activist in Egypt. And she's the co-founder of the Network of Women's Rights Organizations in Egypt and a board member of Musawa, the International Movement for Muslim Family Law Reform. Perhaps most important, she is a performer in the Ana Masri Band, which sings for national unity and equality for all Egyptians, and the band performed on Tahrir Square as well, right?
One of the places.
And Wendell Steavenson, another colleague of mine at The New Yorker, who did an extraordinary job covering the uprising in Egypt and is now living in Cairo, except for brief forays for panels in New York. She's the author of Stories I Stole about her travels in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award, and The Weight of a Mustard Seed, a portrait of the Iraqi general Kamil Sachet. So, we begin with Marwa. Marwa, we are now in the post-ecstatic phase in Egypt. We all watch this extraordinary event going on in Cairo. Wendy covered it for us, and you were involved. First, tell us about your involvement with it and where we are today. Just sort of set the scene for what's going on in Egypt now, now that everybody's left the square.
Sure. I'll start with how it started. Well, in the very beginning, on the 25th of January, actually no one believed that it would be what it was. A lot of people were going down to the street, thinking that it's just one of those regular demonstrations we've been going to for the past 2 years. And I think a lot of us did not really take into consideration the accumulation that had happened over the past 2 years to make 25th of January what it was. And it just suddenly spiraled and increased, and more people started to go to the streets. More and more people were defiant against the police brutality and all the atrocities that were committed against us, unfortunately, by other Egyptians in that government, in that old regime. And there were so many surprises along the way. I mean, in these 18 days, Tahrir Square was a very different Egypt than the one I was used to. It was the Egypt of my grandparents and my parents. You know, in the family, I'm sure it happens here as well, they always tell you how it was much better before, and you know, you guys, you don't know what Egypt was or what America was. It was in a much better state. And Tahrir Square in those 18 days was something, I don't want to romanticize too much, but really no one believes it. It was this utopia. Everyone was helping everyone. There were no differences between rich and poor, between men and women. I mean, some of you who've been to Cairo, then you know that there's a problem of sexual harassment on the streets. Not once in the 18 days did an incident of sexual harassment happen. And we're talking here about thousands, hundreds of thousands of men and women together in a very tight area. People helping each other, feeding each other, medicine coming in, coming out. It was a very, very strange and beautiful atmosphere.
I don't want to digress too much, and nor do I want to over-romanticize too much, but I'd be remiss in not mentioning that there was some sexual harassment.
That was on the final day when Mubarak left, actually, because that was the day when everyone came to Tahrir Square, all those who were already on the square for the 18 days, but many, many more who weren't. Mm-hmm. And there's this thing about the 18 days that it was like a university or a school where you get tutored into it. And the people who came at the very, very last day did not have that kind of advantage to go through that tutoring of the 18 days to have this kind of ethic. So yes, there was, I think it was a Canadian reporter who...
And an American.
Yes, and an American reporter who was regrettably exposed to that. But as I told you, it was very beautiful, very strange, yet very much, it reminded all of us of what our parents and grandparents were talking about when they talked about the real Egypt. This was the real Egypt. This was the Egypt we wanted.
And unlike most historical moments, this one had a discrete end. There was a series of huge demonstrations and political dramas that we all remember well, and weird speeches and better speeches and intrigue involving the United States. And then the old man steps down, or is cast aside, or some combination thereof, and everybody goes home, and the ecstatic moment, as all ecstatic moments do, ends. And where are we now is really my question. On that square, we're mostly people that we would call liberals, not all. There were members of Islamist factions. There were all kinds of people. But that's what political power does not reside with them, so far as I can see. Political power at this point seems to reside
with the army,
with traditional institutions, the army in particular. So aren't Egyptians who were there on Tahrir Square, and I'll bring Wendy into this too, aren't they now headed for, as most revolutions have, a period of enormous disappointment?
Oh yes.
So tell us what's happening.
I'm trying to say it in a different way.
I'm more optimistic. I'm not...
Okay, go ahead. Maybe you have something.
I think Marwa's really... It was an extraordinary thing to be on the square during those 18 days, and I think the thing that Egyptians on the square came away with was an extraordinary sense of empowerment of what could be done and what they could do. To watch them defend that, fight their way onto the square, hold it, defend it, feed people, medicine, blankets, back and forth. I mean, it was impossible not to be moved by it, and it was impossible not to feel biased and to feel swept up on it. And I think that sense of empowerment continues, and that sense of there's a national consensus somehow in Egypt now about what they want. And they want a decent, transparent, representative government, and they don't want a state security system to be overbearing and repressive, and they want to live in a free society and a civil society and a decent society. And I think that's pretty universal, from the Islamic parties right through to the kind of more liberal edge of the Cairo elites. And I think that national consensus and that empowerment is creating new red lines, and the army is noticing that it's hard to cross those lines.
Red lines meaning?
Meaning what's
things
acceptable.
They cannot do without...
Exactly, and the army, being the army, wants to have control, doesn't like unruly protest, doesn't like sort of untidiness.
So,
when they've tried to clear people off the square, and they've done so, and they've tortured people, and they have summarily put people in prison for long sentences after military tribunals. But in each case, there's been a reaction against it, and in each case, they've had to sort of pull back or rethink or apologize or have an investigation. The army is learning where the parameters are, as well as the people, I think, are relearning where the parameters of what society and behavior is.
So if all that's true, Marwa, where does your pessimism reside? Why?
My pessimism resides in that instead of wasting time in trying to tell the army, please don't do this, please do that. I mean, we could have by now done a lot in the past. It's been more than a month now. I mean, we could have at least brought together a commission to draft a new constitution. Everyone in this country believes that this old constitution that Mubarak was ruling with is dead, and it cannot continue. What happened in a couple of weeks earlier was that we had a referendum on amendments to this constitution. For me, this was a waste of time. And yes, you are right that the army keeps playing with us that, okay, if I do this, let's see what are the people going, how are they going to react? But instead of doing that, I mean, we had a revolution, for God's sake. We don't have time, and we have this momentum. We should build on it. The reason why I'm pessimistic is that Egyptians, a lot of them are getting tired. Simple, plain tired. They want to live. They want to be able to have decent food prices. They want their children to go to school. Some of that is already happening, but a lot of people are really in a difficult situation. And we're wasting time trying to convince the army to take a certain route, when in reality, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be working on building the institutions and the democratic infrastructure of this country.
So if I get you right, then what your fear is that through inertia, through deliberate inertia, that the institutions in power, that still are in power, threaten to smother the momentum and basically replace Mubarak with somebody who is slightly more liberal, Mubarak with a human face, as they used to say in Czechoslovakia long ago.
A lot of Egyptians believe that now. Actually, it wasn't the case before, but now they're coming closer to this conclusion.
With good reason, no?
Yes.
Amaney, why did this happen now? A little prehistory. You're an expert in many things, but democratization and the sense of timing here. You know, historians look back and they try to figure out why 1789 happened in 1789, or 1917, or 1989. Steve was just in Tunisia. Did this all happen because somebody in Tunisia burned himself to death and a snowball started to roll, to mix a metaphor horribly, fire and ice? But why now?
Well, I do want to say that when you look at our job in political science as trying to explain or predict these type of events, especially revolutions, we have very little predictable power in our assessments. And I'll be honest with you, nobody saw this coming. When you talk to specialists who study the region, when you talk to specialists who study revolutions, no one really saw this happening. And when January 25th happened, everybody thought it would be another 2 or 3 days of small protests and it would die out.
I think in Wendy's piece you pointed out the CIA had spent millions and millions of dollars in modeling.
Trying to create predictive models for just such sort of political tsunamis. Yeah. But it turns out that earthquakes you can't predict and revolutions neither. No.
Yeah.
So nobody saw this coming. And in fact, when you speak to people, I mean, the people that we've spoken to, or, you know, and of course Marwa can comment about this, as can Wendy, is that people will say the Tunisian events inspired them. If the Tunisian people can go to the streets and defy Ben Ali, who's known to be a repressive leader, then why couldn't they do this in Egypt? Now, looking back, we know why this happened in Egypt. I mean, you had a whole generation basically grow up under authoritarian rule, an Egyptian population that was becoming much more accustomed to global media, universal values, appreciation of freedoms and rights that other people were enjoying, that they were being denied. And also, you know, for the Egyptian youth, they were hitting a very low ceiling in terms of social mobility, in terms of how far their education would take them, in terms of where their careers were going. So there's a lot of anger, frustration, disillusionment on the ground. So it was no surprise that people went to Tahrir Square. It's not like they were leaving these very lucrative jobs or, you know, these promising futures ahead of them. I mean, they were really battling it out for their futures. So in that sense, looking back, we're much better at explaining what happened. But the truth of the matter is, nobody saw this coming.
Steve, you were just in Tunisia. What is the Tunisian experience, which is the matter of weeks ahead of the, historically just weeks ahead of the Egyptian? What is the Tunisian experience where it is now foretell, if anything, for a much larger nation of 87 million in Egypt?
Well, you're right to point out Tunisia is a smaller place, about 11 million people, more compact and socially cohesive than Egypt. They did just take a different path than Egypt 2 weeks ago, and that's what I was fortunate to witness. They essentially had their second revolution in early March when protesters went back into a public square, the Kasbah, and demanded that the interim government yield to a constituent assembly that would entirely rewrite the country's constitution and remake all of its electoral and political laws as the next step. And they specifically protested and stood in front of the guns again and shot, people were shot and killed again, to prevent a quick parliamentary or presidential election this summer, precisely because they feared that the residual institutions of the old dictatorship would capture those transitional elections and embed in power either corrupt tycoons, members of state monopolies, the old monopolistic political party, and the secret police. And so whether this will prove to have been the right way to prevent that or not, we'll see. But there was a coalition that wasn't just spontaneous youth, though that was part of it. It was also institutions of civil society, the labor unions, some of the opposition leftist political parties, and the Islamists. They all joined together to demand this, and they won. So Tunisia is going to do something different than Egypt. They're going to have an election in July to elect a constituent assembly for the purpose of writing a constitution. And what that's going to do is give political parties much more time to organize themselves after decades of essentially being wiped off of the map. And I think this was the anxiety in Egypt. And there were a lot of, when I was in Tunisia, there were a lot of people rooting for a no vote on the referendum in Egypt, hoping that Egyptians too would take more time and challenge the legacy of the old state.
Remember in about 2005, 2006, with a friend of yours doing some reporting in Cairo, I asked, as all reporters do when they come to make their sort of week-long tour of the various groups and so on, just of course see the Muslim Brotherhood, thinking that this is going to be a huge organization with many buildings and attached to a mosque and so on. And I was taken to the Muslim Brotherhood office, and it looked like a bookie's office in the 30s. Sort of 20 harried men nervously wandering around, kind of not doing anything. If they were allowed to smoke, they would smoke, as it were. And I thought, this is the Muslim Brotherhood that everybody's so frightened of? And I went in and had the interviews, and the main guy, whose name, Esram, I think was his name, Ariane, said, sort of erratic things about 9/11 and had the sort of requisite opinions about this, that, and the other thing. But he seemed kind of harmless, kind of out of it. And the picture of the Muslim Brotherhood that we get from outside of the country is that this is the only truly organized, other than the army, truly organized force in the country. There was a piece in the New York Times the other day saying, even though the narrative of the Egyptian revolution was that the Muslim Brotherhood had held back and was not a crucial central figure here, now it's growing again. What's the truth? What's the role of the Muslim Brotherhood? And how should we feel about it as people who are sympathetic more naturally to your politics and point of view?
Okay, the Muslim Brotherhood are part of the political scene in Egypt. And so likewise, they need to be given a space. They need to be able to practice. They need to engage politically, but bearing in mind certain rules, that religion cannot be used to exclude others from the political scene. They have to go through major restructuring. And actually, I was in a debate with Assam Al-Arian last week, which you attended.
That's the one.
Yes. Assam Al-Arian. He is the spokesperson.
Yeah, he's very avuncular. That's why they choose him.
They tried him out.
They tried him out because he smiles and giggles a lot.
But we still want him.
You still want him?
Yes, despite that. And that's exactly because they really seriously need to restructure their program and their way of being, actually. Now,
what does that mean, their way of being?
For example, they came up with a program a few years ago that said, okay, we believe in a civil state, but women and Copts are not going to be allowed to be presidents. What are you talking about? I mean, how can you have a civil state and then you say something like that?
That is confusing.
They took it back, obviously.
Then they took it back and said, no, just in our party we don't want Copts.
Yes, hang on.
So they're improvising.
So they're kind of, I think, a little bit like the army. They're pushing against these new parameters in the kind of general scene as well, a little bit.
And they have a serious problem as well because today, after the revolution, their own youth are revolting against them because within themselves they have undemocratic practices, and the youth can no longer take this anymore. The youth are very respectful. The Muslim Brother youth, they're very respectful towards their elders, but they're also very critical. Now, that said, the Muslim Brotherhood and the former ruling party were the only two organized parties, political parties in Egypt. The rest
of any scale.
Yeah, the rest we call them in Egypt cartoonic parties. They're cartoon parties. The National Democratic Party is being torn apart, but it's still fighting very
the National
hard.
Democratic Party being the ruling party.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're still fighting very hard because a lot of them were businessmen. They have a lot of money. They have access to a lot of thugs, organized thugs, networks. The Muslim Brotherhood remains to be the most organized party or group in Egypt, politically organized in Egypt today. From what we've seen in Tahrir Square and in Suez and in the south of Egypt and everywhere, the Muslim Brotherhood were not the majority of people on the street. We know that they are not the majority. This is a scare tactic, but they are the most organized. And from history, we have seen that even if you're a minority, but you are the most organized, you win. So it does not, it's not about them being 10 or 15% of the population.
Understood. But what are the political ramifications? What are we to feel about an Egypt that has a Muslim Brotherhood that's empowered a great deal more than it ever was before, beyond the fact that this is a good reflection of a growing civil society? What are the international ramifications of it?
So there's probably two dimensions that need to be addressed here. One are the international and regional ramifications, and then also the domestic debates about what role religion will play. Will Egypt emerge as a secular democracy? Will it not? What will happen to minority groups, especially women and Copts? So these are the key questions looking forward. But I think we need to also pay attention to the international and regional issues. The big concern is that the Muslim Brotherhood might be careless. Looking forward with, for example, in terms of, it has said it will uphold the peace treaty with Israel, but will it be kinder, for example, to Hamas government in Gaza? That's a big question, right, first of all. Second of all, the extent to which the Muslim Brotherhood is successful in Egypt will also signal to other Islamic movements what their potentials are. So I think that's also a big geostrategic concern. If an election is seen as returning a large victory for the Islamists, will this empower other Islamists elsewhere? So these are concerns that people, or at least the United States certainly has right now, looking forward in terms of what these elections will signify, not only in Egypt, not only in terms of maintaining a geostrategic partner, but in terms of what will happen in other countries that are partners of the United States as well.
What do you want from the United States? We watched when the demonstrations were going on. There was a lot of, we want this from Obama, we don't want that, and it was very clear that the White House was trying to balance any or throw as many plates up in the air as they possibly could. Ditto in Libya and elsewhere in the region. These are not easy issues when it comes down to American interests and historical hypocrisies and all the rest of it. Right now, in your view, as an Egyptian liberal, if I can call you that, what do you want from the United States, if anything?
Can I be honest?
Here we are. I don't know.
Will I go out
We know
safely?
each other for half an hour. I haven't known you to be anything but. So.
For the sake of the US and for the sake of the Middle East, I think the best route now is for the US to stay away.
Aid to?
I would say aid to. Absolutely.
Keep your money, leave us alone.
Yes. I mean, even in the beginning of the revolution, the government, when they tried, the old regime, when they tried to discredit us, they would call us agents of America. Yeah. And they were the ones taking the aid from the US administration.
But I'm even surprised to hear you call it the old regime, as if the old regime has left with Louis XVI and so on. The old regime is in place except for one guy, no?
Absolutely, that's the point. That is exactly the point. And actually, I want to ask, not you, but the American administration, does it really
That's not
want...
me.
That's not you, I know. Can you just transfer it to them?
I just pick cartoons for a living. That's all I do.
I don't believe that.
You'd be surprised.
The question that I... You're a lucky guy. The question that I would really like an answer, and I know I will never get one, is does the US administration really want democracy in the Middle East?
Steve Coll, who lives in Washington and therefore is responsible for the
Pays taxes.
and pays taxes, which is more than I do. What's the answer to that question? What does America want out of this other than a little bit more quiet than we've gotten lately?
I don't think that the administration has a single answer to that question, as they've made amply clear in public over the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. And within the administration, in the decision-making circles around the president. There are obviously diverse views, have been throughout. There have been those who believe that American interests, it's the duty of the president to manage American interests, and unpleasant though it may be, that required these Faustian bargains with dictators in the region. There were those who were much more optimistic about the potential of the Arab Spring to transform politics in the region. I think the president's instincts have always been, as in his rhetorical flourishes at Oslo and in Cairo, on the side of the revolutions and of the generation that was rising. After all, he was elected president by appealing to a generation of young Americans to defy convention and to empower themselves through his presidency. And he knows, I think intuitively, he knows exactly who is in Tahrir Square. But he's also, as he's demonstrated, a very cautious decision maker, and intellectually tends towards the kind of realist school of making smart decisions on the basis of a narrow sense of American interest. And I think that conflict's played out in what he's said and done from the beginning of all of this. He's probably been ahead of a lot of his advisors in wishing to stand with the people in the street. At the same time, he's been cautious about making practical decisions. And in some cases, as in Bahrain, he's come down on the side of a repressive regime. Yes. For all practical purposes. He has, even though obviously the Bahrainis and the Saudis made their own decision to suppress those demonstrations without, in some respects, defying American advice. Nonetheless, the United States has made plain that it has a double standard in the Arab Spring, that it is willing to tolerate certain kinds of regimes repressing their people and stand with others.
A short answer from each of you. Should we be in Libya? That's the shortest answer ever.
We shouldn't be in Libya because we don't have an action plan for Libya.
We don't have a
plan of action. What will we do in Libya? Are we going to be rebuilding that country? Are we going to be institution building? Is it going to be Iraq all over again? We don't have a game plan.
For argument's sake, and this is the question, this is the dilemma, if by creating we're going farther than creating a free-fly zone, it stopped a gigantic slaughter of what's loosely called the rebels. Is that not a good thing to have done?
It's good when you do it systematically and you have a game plan. I mean, it's not clear that NATO or the United States has a solid plan for a post-Gaddafi Libya.
Steve?
I think, in the real world, you have a choice. Are you going to let these guys go into Benghazi and do what they say they're going to do, or hope that they don't do what they say they're going to do, or do you step in? I think you had to step in on the basis of the evidence.
Wendy?
I think so, too. I think it was a humanitarian moment. It felt a bit like Kosovo. It felt... it's not often when strategic and humanitarian and moral interests coincide, and this seemed like an easy fix to some extent, that you could do it with a few bombs. I think the key is that America is not in Libya, it's above Libya. I think that's a big distinction, and I think it's also a big distinction that there was a UN resolution and that there was an Arab League mandate for it as well. What happens next is as unpredictable as the rest of the region.
Marwa?
I agree with both of you, but I would still think that it shouldn't have been there. The U.S. should not have been there.
I don't see how you can circle that square. How can you?
I'm doing like the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, no, that was a joke. Yes, of course, the humanitarian situation, you couldn't leave someone like Gaddafi do what he was going to do. Absolutely. But the question was, should the U.S. be there? My question is, my answer is the U.S. should not be there. Others could be there with a plan, as Amaney was saying, and definitely not the U.S. with its very tragic history in the region, especially in the non-existence of a plan. A lot of people are on their toes in the region at the moment, thinking that we're probably heading towards another Iraq. The US doesn't want that, the Middle East doesn't want that, no one wants that. And actually, a colleague of mine said, okay, why didn't they give these weapons to the rebels? Why did they themselves have to do it?
Well, my colleague in Libya says that they barely know how to shoot the rebels.
Exactly, I replied with that.
Yeah.
But that's a question, why?
So then let me ask the two of you, if In fact, Assad repeats his father's level of violence against his own people, and there's a Hama. Another way, how many people were killed in Hama? By
10,000.
20,000 and 10,000.
Yeah.
Let's split the difference and say
Yeah.
15,000 people were slaughtered in a
Many.
matter of days in Syria. What do we do there?
I think they have slightly better air defences.
Syria does.
Yeah, I think this is that would be a much more serious military proposition.
So we do what we can. We save people. We
do-
can't save everybody, but we save people.
Well,
when
but we
can.
don't, we haven't for 15 years since the duty to protect was defined after the Rwanda genocide. The question has never been, what do you do alone? The question is, do the facts on the ground cross the threshold of the duty to defend, the duty to protect large numbers of people who are going to be slaughtered by their own government absent intervention? Does the international community find factually that a large group of civilians is at risk from their own government? And having found that, does it have a coalition that can intervene successfully? Now, this has gone on since Rwanda in a number of settings, some more successful than others. In Sierra Leone, in Kosovo, in Bosnia. The African continent is dotted with international interventions. Not all of them are very attractive ones. There's an EU force straddling the border between Chad and Sudan trying to prevent mass slaughter in Darfur. There's 10,000 peacekeepers in the Ivory Coast trying to enforce the correct outcome of that country's election. So, this was not only the United States that decided to act. It was also the Arab League and the European governments and 10 out of however many members of the Security Council, including some countries that don't normally stand with the United States in such things. I think, in short, if Syria's government threatens to kill in Daraa or someplace else thousands and thousands of its own civilians, the international community would be challenged again to ask, are you going to stand by and allow these innocents to be slaughtered again, or are you going to intervene collectively?
Some people fear the role of Iran in a lot of these countries. What about in Egypt? Is that a factor that you have any anxiety about?
For me personally, not really. I mean, we have a lot going at the moment.
We have enough to worry about.
We have enough to worry about, but I'm not a security strategist expert. Maybe something is happening and I'm not aware of it, but for me, it's not my immediate concern at the moment. I don't think it's, for now, a serious threat.
What I mean is, one of the cliches or one of the commonly said things about the way Arab Spring it's been, and it's a stormy spring. Let's remind ourselves, is that in many ways Iran gains from what's happening, the instability on the ground. Does anybody want to?
I mean, I think the concern is that you're seeing a Middle East divided along a pro-Iranian axis and an anti-Iranian axis, or something of that configuration. And so then the question is, well, where is the future of Egypt going to lie in that dichotomy? I think that's an overstated dichotomy. Yes, there are concerns about the regional role that Iran is going to be playing. Yes, Iran is becoming increasingly more powerful in the region. But remember, within Iran, there's a lot of dissent, and across the Arab world, there's a lot of opposition to Iran as well. Mm-hmm. So if you poll the vast majority of Arabs, they don't see for themselves governments like Iran in the future. There's some nationalist type of mobilization behind some of the statements that have emanated from the Iranian regime, but nothing that's really, well ingrained in among the people. Yes, Hezbollah, Hamas, perhaps there's some type of alliance there, some type of support. That's all strategic. These groups benefit from that. It's not clear that the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, and that's where the key concern is, will it align itself in that type of quote-unquote constellation? I think we're overstating that and overstating the polarization. And again, it's feeding into scare tactics about what a future Egypt will look like in the Middle East.
I think the Iranians actually have been the example of the Arab street and the example of the Arab protests have fed again the example of dissent and protest in Tehran and in Iran. And it was interesting that they, felt the need to rearrest a lot of leaders from the Green Revolution who'd been under house arrest and put them in jail properly. And there had been
and worse,
and worse. And there have been demos again in Tehran. I mean, I lived in Iran for a few months once, and I feel like that regime, that edifice, the sort of lie that is the Islamic Republic of Iran is tottering and is more fragile than it's almost ever been, and that the example of the Arab protests overturning their governments only makes it more fragile.
Well, a question is sort of to get out of this geostrategic mode that we're in for a second.
But before you do, can I just
Sure,
add to this?
please do.
Actually, maybe something like a week into the revolution, I think it was Khamenei who came out on TV and said, this Egyptian revolution is a great example of the Islamic Iranian ethos, something of the sort. And you just had to see the reaction of people on the street to that.
Eye rolling. Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, don't come near us. It has nothing to do with you.
I want to speak to one of your big concerns and all of our concerns. One of the great indexes historically of progress in any given state is the status of women. And I want to get a sense from you about the role this is playing in the Egyptian revolution, what role it played on Tahrir Square, and is it having a carryover effect, and in what way, in your experience? Maybe Wendy can talk to this as well, since she's living in Cairo.
Okay, so as I told you, during the 18 days of the revolution, actually, if you ask me how it was for women, I don't have anything extra to tell you except that men and women were exactly the same on the square.
I mean, it's a political issue.
Yes, and it was actually the wonderful thing is that it was a non-issue. In those 18 days, all these barriers just simply had to fall because survival was at stake. Finish the 18 days, and like most revolutions and wars of liberation across the world, the first thing that happens, even though women participate in the war or in the revolution, they die, they get tortured, they pay the price equally, the first thing that usually happens after that is they're asked to go home.
How does that process take place?
Well,
what does that mean to be asked to go home?
It means, okay,
politics
now
time,
we've liberated the country, thank you very much for all your efforts. Now you need to go home to take care of the kids and to cook and, all this. We'll take care of the governing as men. And it has happened so many times, not especially, all over the world. So we had 8th of March came after Mubarak left, and we organized not a sit-in, a demonstration in Tahrir Square to celebrate both the men and the women who died for this revolution. And as we were standing and we were chanting, and we found a whole group of thugs coming. They were obviously very organized, and we have footage, video footage of
Were
them.
they on horses? Because I got to tell you,
this time without horses.
The horse thing was the most terrifying thing I ever
Finally,
saw.
they joined the 21st century, and they were coming out of buses. So, and we were attacked eventually by these thugs. Of course,
who sent the thugs? Who
that's
are
the big
they?
question. Actually, we don't know. All we know is that it seemed very organized. You could see one of these thugs, he would come to a group, try to exhaust us by engaging in futile attacks and conversation, and then move to another group using the same tactics again. And I mean, it was obvious that they are hired. So they are not representative really of the Egyptian man, but we don't know who did it until now. The issue is, I have to be very careful because, especially with a Western audience, I definitely will be very skeptical if the Islamists make it to power regarding women's rights. But that does not mean that you cannot use Islam as a reference for equality between men and women. You just said that I'm a board member in the Musawa International Movement for family law reform, Muslim family law reform, and this is our premise, that actually Islam over the years has been used by these Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Jama'ah, all these people to justify differences between men and women. Now there is a whole new movement, a whole new scholarship.
In the negative sense.
In the negative sense, with the Muslim Brotherhood, yeah, and these other groups. But today, there are many, many groups emerging and coming up and using Islam as a reference to support equality between men and women. And it's a knowledge project. There's a lot of knowledge being produced from the Quran, from the Sunnah, the tradition of the Prophet, to actually justify this. And that's why I'm very careful that the issue is not with Islam per se. It is how it's being used by which groups for what purpose. That's the point.
And you're hesitant because you think a Western audience can't absorb this difference.
No, I'm hesitant because a Western audience, and also some in the Middle East, are comfortable with the idea that Islam is to blame for the problem of women.
Period.
And that is not usually the case. And you need to be more complex while analyzing this. Look, I don't want to take too much time. Maybe.
No, I mean, I think the point that Mehmet was making is right on target, that we've seen within these Islamic law regimes, or this the personal status regime, and these are the personal status laws that guide matters relating to the private lives of women in the Muslim world. We've seen a lot of variation across the Muslim world. So the idea is that there's not this one monolithic Islamic interpretation of what the role of women should be like in these societies. So this does raise the question of how groups can use the teachings of Islam, if you will, or the interpretations of Islam, to push for a more women-friendly set of legislation based on equality, and push those through. I mean, these regimes have upheld very unequal laws when it comes to women's rights, almost as a means of winning over traditional and conservative pockets of support to stay in power. And so now there's hope now in this new era that women will probably have better access to power and to government to extract some laws that are more favorable to them. However,
depends who's in power.
Yeah, it depends what the government.
But but even within the constitutional debates, it's still in Egypt. My understanding is that it's. Basically, the president of Egypt must be married to an Egyptian woman. So it's not only that women are not.
They changed it because of the pressure.
Did they? Yeah, because that was.
So, and I'm not sure if that she needs to be married to an Egyptian man, but so that these are now debates happening within Egyptian society, and I think the political opening is going to allow for these conversations to occur, depending on who emerges in power.
It was very interesting in Tunisia because the dictatorship enforced the most secular personal status code in North Africa. Was well known for the extent of paper rights that were granted to Tunisian women. And I was surprised just because of my own lack of understanding to get there and to meet with Tunisian women who said, first of all, that secular personal status code had been completely discredited by its association with dictatorship because it had politicized the rights of women and associated them with authoritarianism. So now there was this whole new space of, well, what is the people's version of the personal status code now that we've decoupled it from the dictator? And also, obviously, an understanding that the claims that the Tunisian dictatorship made for the status of women in Tunisian society did not bear a resemblance to their actual experience in society. So how do you address that gap without eliminating the secular rights that these women had enjoyed for a generation?
One of the things that surprised me in your piece this week in the magazine on Tunisia was that you, as the visitor, proposed the notion that maybe Turkey would be a model for a future Tunisia, a kind of democracy in which Islam plays a great role, or like the AKP party and so on. And they said, no, 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 no. And the next thing you know, they were talking about Switzerland and where else?
Yeah, Britain and France. I mean, I basically hung out in the Kasbah for every day that I could, and in a sort of non-scientific way, tried to do what a political scientist would do, which was ask everybody the same question. So what do you have in mind? What are your models? And I said, what other countries do you have in mind? And I stupidly thought that people would say, well, think of other kind of Muslim societies that had constructed constitutional democracies of some sort or another. So I was thinking, well, I'll keep a little chart of my Turkey answers and my Indonesia answers. And I didn't get one. Basically, the only answers I got were France, Britain, and Switzerland.
Does that match up with more scientific numbers?
I think there's a lot of appreciation for the legal codes in Western democracies and in terms of what they do to afford individuals, women, and other groups their rights. I think people are fed up with basically their rights being mishandled, if you may, in the name of Islam.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take some questions from the audience, and to do so, I think there are microphones on either side. And maybe it would help to also bring up the lights a little bit. Would that be possible, so we can see you? Oh, you're so lovely. There you are. Okay. And the mics are where, Rhonda? Okay. Sure. Go ahead.
Better first. Thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I wanted to ask about something that was only tangentially touched on, and that is the future of the Israel-Palestinian peace process. It seems that the Netanyahu government has responded to the Arab Spring by kind of doubling down, lost Mubarak and Abdullah's weekend, and kind of its entire security apparatus has been shaken. And Abbas and Fayyad seem to be moving more towards national reconciliation with Hamas and perhaps new Palestinian elections. I know prognostication is dangerous, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you see Israel moving in the next few months to years, and how the Arab Spring will impact Israel moving forward.
Wendy's been living in Israel for the last X months. I don't know.
Well, 1 month, and then
Okay.
the Arabs revolted,
Well,
and
1 month.
I was distracted.
My fault again. You want to start?
I think the
That's
Israelis
mine.
are kind of freaked, and I think they're keeping their heads down because it was easy to deal with their neighbors when there was just one man to deal with, and now they're going to have to deal with a population, and a population that will have different opinions, and they don't know how it's going to shake down. I think that Egypt is not, there's been no talk of rescinding, the peace or anything like that, but certainly their relationship with Israel will change, and Israel's going to have to respond to that.
You were born in the Islamic Republic of California, I think. But your father moved you back to Ramallah when you were a teenager, am I right?
When I was 11.
Yeah. And so you've spent a lot of time, Lord knows, in the West Bank. And tell us what effect you think this will have, if any, both on Palestinian politics as such and also the Arab-Israeli conflict in general.
Well, I think there's a few things going on. Again, for the longest time, not only in Egypt, but across the Arab world and in the Palestinian camp, there was this idea that public opinion did not matter as much. It was not crucial for the type of bilateral relations, regionally or internationally. So somebody like Mahmoud Abbas is basically concerned about the mass mobilization that Egypt witnessed, and basically he's moving towards reconciling the ranks and opening up conversations with Hamas. It's no coincidence that it happened immediately after Egypt, and they're beginning to see where Palestinian sentiment is, at least signaling to the Palestinian people that there's a possibility of reconciliation. What this means from Israel's perspective is also, again, a new Middle East in the sense that they're no longer dealing with leaders that don't represent their citizens. So this opens up the issue of now, to what extent are bilateral treaties, bilateral ties with authoritarian leaders that are way above their people and not held accountable to their people, sufficient in maintaining the peaceful status quo in the country. This is not to say that the war is going to break out, that if democracy emerges in Egypt, you're going to have basically the first act of the new government is to declare war on Israel. No. But what this does mean is that it's a new Middle East where public opinion can't be dismissed, or it cannot. Or you can't seem that you can't isolate yourselves from the sentiments of people in the region.
Okay. Is there somebody? Yet can't quite see.
Hi. Again, congratulations on the panel. Very informative, very good. I recently saw in Al Jazeera Hirschberg, along with some other commentators whose names I won't remember here, saying that, in a hopeful way, that apparently this is the very big chance for the first time in a long time that the Arab world will finally be seen through its own, deeds and or misdeeds, and not through the optics of, the U.S. and Israel. That in the West, and particularly, of course, in the Western world, in Europe, the Arab world was always seen by what, in a way, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting what they were saying, but what Israel fed that the Arab world actually was and looked like. And now, for the first time, we were having a chance
Are you talking
because
about
of
the
what
media,
that's happened.
sir? I'm not quite sure what you mean. You're talking about the media?
Well, the media and actually even the comprehension by governments in general, you know, but that the Arab world will finally be seen by.
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
I understood
try?
you to say that
Thank God.
it's both the media and also
Is
what
there-
governments understand of Arabs to be, right?
Right. I mean, they were saying that finally this is a chance for the Arab world to be seen by what is actually happening in the Arab world, not by what is represented through the optics of Israel primarily in the Western world.
Okay, thanks.
Is there
Okay.
hope for that? Is there beginning to happen, or?
I think they're being a bit too optimistic. I mean, it's too early now to say. The machine is still going. It's exactly the same in Egypt. The machine, the old regime, as you rightfully said, is still there. We are dismantling it bit by bit. The same with the kind of media and the kind of channels and institutions that used to channel this idea of what the Arab is to the Western mind. They're still working. I mean, yes, a great revolution has happened and all the networks, the media networks have covered the 18 days, but that's not enough. I mean, what has been done for the past 30 years cannot just be undone immediately like that. So yes, I'm also hopeful, but I'm also realistic to know that it's not just going to happen immediately. The machine is still going. We need to dismantle it bit by bit, and it goes both ways. The Arabs need to show for that, but also both Israeli foreign policy and Western foreign policy have to change for that to happen.
Be specific. What do you want to happen?
As I said before, for example,
to take Israeli foreign policy, for example.
The very
You
telling.
have only 5 minutes.
I have only 5 minutes. I know it's too much.
Yeah.
It's very telling that during the revolution, the main staunchest ally of Hosni Mubarak was Israel. And I think it was in Haaretz or in one of the Israeli newspapers. They were saying that if Mubarak goes, it will be a catastrophe for Israel. This kind of discourse needs to change. If Israel, and Amaney is correct, there will be no war with Israel in the Middle East. And I can talk about Egypt. Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel. This peace treaty is not going to be defied. So in that scenario, in that situation, Israeli foreign policy has to change its discourse in supporting such dictators or supporting even the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. I mean, I've read several articles on US and Israeli foreign policy, and some of these political analysts, I don't claim to be one, but some of these political analysts have reached the conclusion that both the US and Israel might not actually mind too much if we have an Islamist government in Egypt. Bearing in mind that they would have a certain deal with them.
I haven't read that.
Yeah, well, actually, some of them were American. I think it was published in Al Masri. Anyway, I had to read some of that before coming.
Trust me that that's neither mainstream American opinion nor Israeli opinion.
I think what matters today is not whether the Islamists make it to power in Egypt or not. I think what matters today is that both Israel and the US and the Western world really question their intentions and develop a certain foreign policy that supports the creation of a democracy in the Arab world. This is what's important, and this is what will maintain peace.
Right
I definitely have a question, but I also want to comment
A little
quick.
louder, please.
I have a question, but I also want to do a quick comment. The comment first, if you don't mind. We said earlier, you guys were saying we couldn't really foresee the types of events that were happening in Egypt and Tunisia, but in looking back at some of what's been going on, how could we have not missed this? Egypt was due to have presidential elections in 2011 with the parliamentary elections.
History is filled with instances when you look back, how could we have missed it? Ask your question. I think that's the better way to go. Please ask your question.
The question is, I hear a lot about wanting a secularist Egypt. What does that mean? As an Egyptian, I think of my government as secular, except when it comes to the laws that govern the people when it comes to family law. How is that different from the calls for a secularist government?
I think, just really briefly to try to address your question, in our everyday discourse here, a lot of things are being conflated. So the question is, so to answer your question, it's the family laws that are a concern, first of all, because they're seen, and they are, disadvantageous to women. So that's the first set of issues. But so will those laws be taken care of in a new secular framework? But the bigger question that's guiding these conversations is, will the nature of democracy in Egypt be a liberal form of democracy, the way we have democracy in the West? And that's the big question. And for the understanding behind that question is that liberal democracies tend to be united by a set of cultural values or universal values or shared values that will not pit, quote unquote, the Western liberal world order against an Islamic world order. I mean, more or less, that's the underlying tension there. Now, if we understand liberal democracy to be what it is in the West, we didn't arrive at liberal democracy in the West overnight. It was almost hundreds of years, or tens and tens of years of trial and error before we got there. So the assumption that we're going to have a liberal democratic order in Egypt overnight by the first election is false. There's going to be a lot of negotiations, a lot of trial and error, just like the Muslim Brotherhood putting out laws and then having to retract them because there's no popular support for those laws. That's going to happen, but those debates can only happen through the democratic process. So my worry is that we have such high hopes for the electoral process in Egypt in the next year that if it returns anything other than this pristine, ideal, liberal democratic order, we're going to say, democracy is not, the Middle East is not ready for democracy. They were better off with Mubarak. And if we look at the revolution in France in the 1800s, bourgeois democracy did not emerge until 20 years after that revolution, right? And even if we delay the elections in Egypt, you're not going to have liberal parties emerge overnight.
No, it took 2 centuries for America to have voting rights for all
I
its
think
citizens.
the problem is not the first election, the problem is the second election. The problem is not having the bad guys in, is you want to get the bad guys out when you don't like them. That's
there needs
the
to be
correction.
room for trial and error.
Exactly.
Right?
And
you need
if you
to be
can
able
get
to allow these countries the autonomy to develop.
if you can get the structure right, if they can vote them out, it'll be okay.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on. Actually, my question follows on to the recent conversations. First of all, let me have a preamble which says that I think we mistake when we think that elections make democracy. It takes a great deal more in a society to make a democracy than to have elections. And David, you'd mentioned 1789, 1917. Those are examples of mass uprisings against autocratic governments by people who had no history whatsoever of democratic institutions. I think that characterizes the Arab world pretty well as well. And given that situation, can we expect this? But let me finish. Can we expect this revolution, unlike previous revolutions, to not revolve 360 degrees?
Actually, that's exactly why I'm saying now that we need another revolution for this other revolution to work.
The first one was so much fun.
It was, yes, but now we have work to do. And exactly the point. We need to build that kind of infrastructure. And the debate I was telling you about that we had with Isam al-Arian, the Muslim Brotherhood spokesperson, was precisely about that. They were pushing for very fast elections. And my side, we were pushing for...
reasons.
Yes, yeah. We were pushing for postponing the elections. How can we have elections? Thank you very much. How can we have elections if we don't have a proper constitution that regulates parliament, that regulates the presidential powers, that regulates the whole political system in Egypt? That's one thing. They are rushing to go through parliamentary elections because they know they are the only organized political party at the moment in Egypt. And other things. I mean, why are we only talking about political parties? You have we are having now a whole new movement in Egypt where the syndicates are being freed. They were totally controlled by the government.
The labor unions.
Yeah, labor unions, syndicates, student unions, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. These are all part of the civil society, the democratic infrastructure. You need to have first to be able to build upon and have a real democracy. And this needs time. I'm not talking 10 years, but definitely not having elections in the coming September.
Okay.
What's really interesting about this is that a whole region with similar language, similar religion, but a whole region has just exploded, like one too many Vietnams. Are we going to see this proliferate elsewhere?
Let's hope it's not like many Vietnams.
But it's the concept of, I love the sign that I saw, I think on Al Jazeera, of a demonstrator holding a sign, Egypt supports Madison, Wisconsin. So whether it's a despotic government in Burma or Congo or Madison.
They had it in London this weekend, strike like an Egyptian.
Right. So wherever these despotic governments
are,
even
Didn't you think that was a bid to get on TV?
No.
There's a little bit of baseball games, I love ABC or something.
But it's the same concept, whether it's a despotic government in Congo or Burma or the plutocracy that we have here undermining equal fiscal rights. How is this going to proliferate around the world? And it's happening so much in the Arab world. Will it spread, or is it just going to be contained?
Well, actually, I mean, it's happened elsewhere in the world, and it's coming to the Arab world. The Arab world was the anomaly. That's what was so striking about the generation that forged the revolution in Tunisia. They were living in a wider world where in Latin America and Asia, in many sections that were previously governed by dictatorships, people have stood in the street, taken bullets, and forged imperfect but new constitutional arrangements. And they've opened up their economies, and they've thrown off this silencing that the dictatorships imposed. And so it was actually, it's the Arab world that is the anomaly in the wider world today. And it was striking how easy it was for the youth, at least in Tunisia, who were aware of that, to claim it, to say, no, we're a part of we have the same expectations as Democrats in Brazil and Indonesia.
Over here. And then you. Oh, sorry.
First of all, excellent discussion. My question is, Al-Qaeda has been conspicuously low-key during the Arab Spring, but Al-Qaeda, we know, has not evaporated. What impact is the Arab Spring having on Al-Qaeda's reach and ability to recruit in the region?
Steve, you've written 2 books on Al-Qaeda. Maybe you could take a crack first.
Well, their dilemma before the spring was that they were resilient as a military or terrorist organization in some respects, but they were failing politically. They had no successful political strategy, and I think this is only demonstrated to most people in the Arab world and outside that Al-Qaeda's theory of political change is irrelevant to the generations that are rising. Now, there are alliances between sections of Al-Qaeda and some of the more radical Islamist parties that will fill up some of this space, and Al-Qaeda is a very opportunistic network that looks for space and tries to fill it up. But this is not their political narrative. This is a very different narrative than the one that they've been propagating, and I don't think the fact that they have been as quiet and tongue-tied as they have been since this unfolded, to me, is evidence that they actually don't quite know what to say, because they know that no one will believe them if they claim this as something of their own.
I think we have time for one last question. Anna.
Thank you. I wanted just to comment one thing, that the liberation of the mind which comes after the revolution takes a lot of time. I remember in Romania, people were voting thinking that Ceausescu was still alive, although they saw him dead on TV many times. The same happened in... He's dead? I wrote about it, but it was the New Republic, not the New Yorker. I'm sorry.
Touché.
It was for Rick.
Yeah, go ahead.
The same happened in Bosnia, and this I wrote for...
What's your question, Anna?
The question is, when Steve was going around Tunis and when Wendell was going around Tahrir Square, did anybody mention anything like 1989 or Eastern Europe, somewhere between Turkey and Switzerland, where we belong?
No, I think that that was too long ago. They were too young to remember 1989, unlike me, because I remember that well. But interestingly, and to show how what Steve was talking about, the example of how the world has overthrown dictatorships before, I was talking to a guy who was telling me about how he became politically aware when he was 17 and he left the Arab world for the first time and went to Prague. And it was 1995, right? So 5 years after that wall fell down, and already he was getting an example and a sense of what it was to be free and what a free society was. And when he went back to Egypt, he was a heavy metal fan. And somehow the government got it into their heads that heavy metal fans were satanic, and this went out, and there was a big campaign against satanic heavy metal fans, and they were persecuted, and his friends were rounded up, and they would call him up and say, take your posters down. And he had had the experience of being in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic. And so the example of how these things go and travel and the wider world is an important one.
And actually, when we were, at some point we had to sit and prepare, okay, for what comes next. And one of the countries that, actually several countries came up with, Czech Republic and Slovenia. And we had, some of us, I don't know, I read a bit about Slovenia, not much, but some of us had to go and study some of these experiences. And not just, I mean, obviously Chile and Argentina. And so actually these countries, we weren't even aware, as you say, that they had revolutions and they had
So suddenly
liberation.
this discussion is percolating.
Now we are becoming aware that, no, there are other experiences in other countries. There's just one very quick thing for the previous question that I just wanted to address, that in an article in The Guardian 2 days ago, I'm sorry I don't remember the writer, but he was warning that the same thing, these spring of revolutions, is going to move to the US, actually. Surprise, surprise. And his reasoning being that the reason why this has happened in the Arab world is not just only because of the presence of these horrible, horrible dictators, but also because the huge discrepancy between rich and poor, between powerful and powerless. And he was making a kind of similarity between that and what's happening. He said, in the West, he's obviously either American or British, and he said, we shouldn't really think that what we have here is democracy. In 2003, the Iraq war, hundreds of thousands went down in the streets, and still the governments went to invade this country. So if we're saying that the Arabs are revolting because they don't have democracy, and that this would never happen to us here because we have democracy, he was critiquing that very strongly. And I think it's better to start working on that from now. And I'm telling that to you to tell the government.
I have a
better
regular
to work on that from now instead of having
Steve,
a wonderful revolution.
I want to thank you all. You've been terrific, and thanks to you all for coming. Thank you. You're really, really marvelous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dara.